All right. So, hi everyone. A warm welcome to this Research Notes seminar hosted by the Resources, Environment and Development Department, the Reed Department at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. My name's Simon West and I'm a lecturer with the Reed Department. And I'd like to open the seminar by acknowledging that we're hosting this talk on the sovereign and unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And in particular, in the context of today's seminar, I'd like to acknowledge all of the expertise on sustainability that Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples have been practicing for a very long time. And today we're really very privileged and honored to have with us Professor Chris Riedy, who will talk about zero carbon imaginaries, official and fictional. So Chris is a professor of sustainability transformations and associate director of learning and development at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, UTS. Chris is also an advisor to the transformations community, was co-chair of the Transformations Conference in Sydney a couple of years ago, and senior research fellow of the Earth System Governance Project as well. He was contributing author on the recent IPBES Transformative Change Assessment that came out at the end of last year, and is on the editorial boards of journals Futures and also Global Social Challenges Journal. Chris is an action researcher who uses sociological and political theory to design, facilitate, and evaluate practical experiments in transformative change towards sustainability. So the structure of the session is that Chris will present for around 35 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for about 20 minutes of discussions, questions at the end. A couple of little items before we start. We'll be recording the presentation so it can be made available online through the Crawford YouTube channel afterwards, but we'll edit out the Q&A section. And then also, if everyone could just remember to keep their mics on mute during Chris's presentation, that'd be great. And I'll bring you all into the conversation and discussion at the end. It's a great, very current topic and lots to discuss, I'm sure. So yeah, very warm welcome, Chris. Thanks so much for joining today. It's really appreciated, and I'll hand over to you for the presentation.
Thanks very much, Simon. Great to be talking to you today. Really appreciate the invitation. Yeah, so this is some work in progress on the idea of zero carbon imaginaries, looking at official imaginaries and some of the alternatives emerging in some new subgenres of climate fiction that are starting to emerge. So I'll add my brief acknowledgement to Simon's. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Dharawal people today in Thirroul, just to the south of Sydney. And so I want to acknowledge those custodians alongside the others that Simon mentioned. I'm from the Institute for Sustainable Futures up at the University of Technology, Sydney, and we've been around since 1997 with a mission to create change towards sustainable futures, working across the various dimensions that you can see here. And my work particularly is around energy transition and climate change response. But I'm also our Associate Director of Learning and Development, so looking after our transformative learning programs and graduate research program. So the starting point for this work is really that we've got as close as we can get to a consensus that we need to get to net zero emissions. And the IPCC puts it in this nice, simple, pithy statement in the synthesis report: limiting human-caused global warming requires net zero CO2 emissions. Now that obviously hides deep contestation. What's the pace at which we need to get to net zero? What are the pathways, the kind of technologies and practices and so on that are going to take us there? But I wanted to start with that relatively consensus statement and move on from there to what are the sort of basis of the contestation, more from a cultural and narrative perspective than other perspectives. And achieving that zero carbon future is clearly a transformative challenge. We've had this more than a century of steady growth in greenhouse emissions. We're going to have to deliberately transform some key social ecological systems, our energy system, our transport system, our agricultural systems. And we often talk about that in terms of the new technologies that are emerging in economic instruments and institutional change. But I want to approach it from this perspective of imagination. And I love this quote from the mysterious director of the Imaginary Foundation, who said, "Imagination is the beginning of all achievement. To imagine is to perceive many potential futures, select the most delightful possibility, and then pull the present forward to meet it." Which is great, but who decides what the most delightful possibility is? And that's what I'm really interested in this work, the contesting imaginaries that are trying to shape what a zero carbon future will look like for humanity. And I guess the point I'm coming from is that the climate crisis is as much a crisis of meaning and imagination as it is a material crisis. So it's important to look at how we're imagining these kinds of futures, and what because they do have real implications. They shape what we do in practice. So I'm drawing a lot on this concept of social imaginaries, which emerged from the work of Jacques Lacan and has been developed by other philosophers and theorists that you can see there. And I'm particularly working with Charles Taylor's definition, which is that a social imaginary talks about the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. So imaginaries are obviously intangible, but they have real material consequences. They are things that enable our social practices and give them legitimacy. Um, they give meaning to the present, but they also have included in them visions of different futures, possible futures, preferable futures, in ideal terms. They're dynamic in that they're not fixed, they're constantly changing. And they're plural. Well, we can talk about there being dominant social imaginaries and what I'll be looking at as official imaginaries, or hegemonic imaginaries today. There's always alternative imaginaries competing to provide meaning. So competing for to gather people that adhere to those imaginaries. And those imaginaries, you can talk about them applying within different groups at different scales as well. So a very sort of plural understanding of imaginaries that I'm working with here. So getting more specific about the idea of zero carbon imaginaries, there was some work done by Levy and Spicer over a decade ago now, looking at the idea of a climate imaginary as a shared socio-semiotic system of cultural values and meanings associated with climate change and appropriate economic responses. And they identified four different climate imaginaries: the fossil fuels forever imaginary, looking at ways we can keep using fossil fuels and using things like carbon capture and storage to keep going as we are. The climate apocalypse dystopian imaginary that we're heading into a deep crisis. The techno market imaginary that says we can solve all of this with new technologies and market solutions. And the sustainable lifestyles imaginary that's more about transformation in values and different ways that people would live to respond to climate change. So I'm adapting that definition a little bit to talk about this idea of zero carbon imaginaries as a shared socio-semiotic system of cultural values and meanings, envisioning a zero carbon future and appropriate pathways towards that future. So my research questions in this work are really looking at what we could think of as official or hegemonic imaginaries. How do key institutions governing the response to climate change imagine a zero carbon future? And I'm taking a methodological approach that centers on Sydney and samples official publications, sort of taking a slice from the global right down to the local. So looking at things like Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change publications and International Energy Agency. What's the Australian government saying about net zero? State governments, local governments, and not just governments, but industry publications and NGO publications as well at different scales. And then I'm looking at fictional imaginaries. So there's lots of different places I could look for alternative imaginaries to that official or hegemonic imaginary. I've started by looking at fictional imaginaries because they often prefigure the emergence of new social imaginaries in art, in creative practice. We see alternative imaginaries first starting to emerge, and this is an idea that's been present in futures thinking for a long time. We often see new technologies. I think of the Dick Tracy smartwatch, which has now become the Apple Watch. That these ideas first appear in fiction quite often. So I'm focusing on climate fiction, obviously, because by definition, it's the fiction that focuses on climate change and might have something to say about what a zero carbon future could look like. But most of that fiction is dystopian. Um, I would say 90% of climate fiction is warning us about what a future under climate change could be like. And there's not a lot of hope in a lot of that fiction about what can an alternative zero carbon imaginary that we actually want to aim towards look like. But there are some more hopeful emerging subgenres in that space of climate fiction, like solar punk, hope punk, and Throughtopia, that I'll talk about a bit more. And I'm particularly focusing on those because they are sources of more hopeful zero carbon imaginaries. So, how do those subgenres imagine a zero carbon future? And then looking across both of them, how fit are these zero carbon imaginaries for the purpose of realizing a safe climate? How might they be enriched to better meet their purpose, that purpose? I won't go into this slide too much. It's the analytical framework that I'm using to identify social imaginaries, and it's got a few different layers to it. So I'm looking at uh, from a semiotic perspective, what are some of the key signs that signal a what's going on in a particular social imaginary? So images, symbols, metaphors, memes that appear frequently in the work. What are actors that are spoken about in the social imaginary, and what sort of roles and relationships do they have? What sort of agency are they assumed to have? Um, what sort of values are expressed in the publications that I'm looking at, sort of visions of the future, and then assumptions and norms, and what sort of narratives are present in the work as well. So those are sort of, you can think of it as a coding framework, if you like, that when I'm looking through these publications, these are the kind of things that I'm looking for that start to give color to the imaginary that we're looking at in that publication. So I'll start with some examples of and I've looked at a lot of other publications beyond what I'll cover today, and I'll give a little bit of a summary after some of these examples of what I'm seeing looking across them more broadly. But if we're thinking about some of the official publications and starting from the global scale and getting more local, we can start with the IPCC synthesis report that came out in 2023. So looking at the summary for policymakers here. And one thing that strikes me about a lot of these official publications is the color schemes. They're often using these really cool colors that almost like it's trying to take the heat out of climate change. We've got cool blues, cool greens. They're very rarely in a alarming red or purple or a color like that. Designed, I guess, to give a sense of reassurance that we, the official uh, organizations, the governance institutions, have got this under control, and you don't have to worry. We're going to sort it out. Beyond that sort of first impression, the obviously if you've looked through an IPCC report, they're highly technical and complex, lots of charts. It's really there's not many people in these publications either. It's a story with no characters. So it's an imaginary for an elite audience. It's not something that most ordinary people are going to engage with. And Taylor, when he talks about imaginaries, talks about them being present in the images, stories, and legends of ordinary people. So this is not an imaginary expressed in this kind of publication that's very likely to be taken up by the broader populace or appeal to them in any particular way. So that's one example. And you can see also the cover image. We've got this this road, but it's taken at a slower shutter speed so that the cars are all are blurred out, and it's this pathway into the future. But again, you can't see any people in this pathway. It's very sort of abstract. If we look at another global one, or International Energy Agency, is really focused on the OECD, so not quite global, but they have a net zero plan. And again, there's lots of abstract imagery. The front cover has got these sort of weird metallic looking zeros that are hooked together, but again, there's no people in this world that they're imagining. Really strong sort of technological and sectoral focus. It does talk about behavior change and the role of citizens and governments, and that the transition to net zero is for and about people. So it's not ignoring human agency, but if you page through the document, you'll find very little imagery of people actually making a difference on taking us to a net zero future. So it's again full of charts and plans, very focused on technologies, and as with many of these publications, this language of net zero. So there's this implicit acceptance that we're going to have some sort of offsets. We're going to balance out sinks and sources, but some sectors are going to be doing more than others. Hot off the press, this is sort of some preliminary analysis of Australia's net zero plan, which only came out very recently. Again, a very reassuring colour scheme of cool blues and greens. Had a look through the imagery in the main report, and there's 56 images in the main body of the report. Only 7 had any people actually present. 9 of them had some nature-based elements, although most of those were agricultural. 18 showed technology, and 30 of them were charts or infographics. So really sort of repeating this theme of this imaginary of technological responses, of dry technical charts and infographics, uh, and very little involvement of people, very little role for human agency in actually achieving this future. What we also see in the Australia's response is a really strong focus on economic opportunity. So this was present in sort of the earlier documents leading up to the net zero plan, and continues to be present in the one that came out very recently, that committing to an ambitious target is necessary to maximise the chances of Australia capturing the full potential benefits of the global clean energy transition. So it's more about this idea of economic opportunity than maybe we should stop all these climate disasters. And then we get eventually at page 91, we get to a section that's about working together, that belatedly recognizes that, yes, everybody has a role to play here after we've gone through a lot of detail about technologies and the role of governments and institutions. As we get a little bit more, as we get smaller in scale, things start to get a little bit more tangible, and there's a little bit more role for people that starts to emerge, is the general sense that I get from these official publications. So the New South Wales Net Zero Plan, we start to have imagery and case studies that start to give a little bit of a sense of what a zero carbon future might look like in that place in New South Wales. It doesn't, in this particular plan, doesn't attempt to depict any sort of imagined futures that break very much from the present, but it does sort of look at innovations that are happening right now that perhaps more of that is what we're going to expect to see in this imagined zero carbon future. Technology remains really central in this plan. Ordinary people start to have more of a role, but it's quite circumscribed. They're consumers who are going to make sustainable choices if given better information. So very much coming out of a rational economic theory model. And you can see that in the net zero priorities there that mostly it's about we've got uptake of technologies, we've got investing in the next wave of emissions reduction innovation, but we do have empower consumers and businesses to make sustainable choices. So not to act as citizens or activists, but to consume in appropriate ways. And New South Wales government leadership by example. And then it gets most tangible when we get to a local government scale, like the City of Sydney. So here we actually have, in some of the imagery, attempts to imagine what the city would look like in a different future, in a net zero future. So they don't radically depart from what the city looks like now, I would say, but taking sort of familiar landscapes, familiar landmarks in the city and reimagining them to some extent, often mainly just by bringing in more vegetation seems to be the main thing that happens in this imagery, but at least it's an attempt to say what might the city look like in a different future, in a net zero future, so that people can start to perhaps feel some inspiration from that it might be a future that they want to buy into. City of Sydney, of course, is targeting net zero by 2035. There's again lots of technical waterfall charts and roadmaps, but it does have a lot more consideration of the role of people and partnerships. So there's an interesting sort of as we get closer to a local scale, we get a lot more consideration of human agency and a lot more tangible imagery about what the future that we're aiming for might start to look like. Looking across all of the official publications, what we start to see on the coding framework is, and I don't want to spend again too much time on this more detailed slide, but we're seeing the kind of signs and symbols that we see. We're talking about net zero, about electrification. There's lots of road maps. There's often metaphors about races or the window is closing. Lots of charts and technological imagery. The main actors are governments creating the enabling environment, businesses innovating and adopting new practices, and consumers to adopt and invest in consumer energy resources. We see the kind of values that we see are around the economic opportunity, around keeping action affordable, sustainability and livability, and urgency as well. Visions for the future, we see a very sort of technological vision where, if you like, the most things stay the same, but we unplug the fossil fuel energy system and we drop in the new renewable energy system and we electrify. Maybe there's some nature-based solutions in there as well, and certainly a net gain in jobs. Very much employment focus is fairly central to the vision. Assumptions that there's a scientific consensus and urgency. There's a lot of technological optimism and a focus on innovation, economic rationality and economic opportunity. Some of them talk about the importance of phasing out fossil fuels. Certainly a strong governance and policy framework that government is really taking the lead in a lot of these publications. And some focus on inclusivity and social justice. And the narrative could be summarized as something like a zero carbon future requires a comprehensive economic transformation that will be led by established institutions and result in a future energy system based on renewable energy. It is primarily a technological change that can deliver economic benefits. Consumers can continue consuming as normal. So a very techno-modernist imaginary where science, technological progress, and rational consumers will get us to net zero. So in some, the institutional imaginaries are pretty dry and abstract and uninspiring, although as we get to a smaller scale and the relationship to place gets closer, they do get more tangible and more imaginative. A lot of focus on pathways without really telling us what this zero carbon world would look and feel and be like. There's not a lot of vision in there. Heavily focused on technological development with not a lot of human agency. Uh, Australia, as I said, leaning heavily into economic narratives. And there seems to just be this real struggle to break from the present and imagine a transformed world, even when we're thinking out as far as 2050. Um, but of course, it's mostly not aimed at a general public audience. I don't think inspiration is the goal here necessarily. So turning then, if that's what the official imaginaries are telling us, what do we start to see in this alternative space of climate fiction? And so I'm looking particularly at these emerging subgenres of solar punk, hope punk, and throughtopia. So solar punk could be defined as optimistic science fiction that imagines a future founded on renewable energies. It's really trying to tease out what a world that's based on, particularly on solar power, but other kinds of renewable energies might look and feel like. It's very much an aesthetic movement as well as a literary movement. You'll see solar punk imagery all over the web. There's various streams to it. There's a stream I would think of and has been written about as a more modernist utopian stream that's very much imagery of really high-tech buildings blended with nature and still sort of falling into that trap that the official imaginaries fall into of not having much role for people in that imagery. So these gleaming cities filled with nature, but no people anywhere in them. But there's also a real postmodern emancipatory stream where it's about people with diverse identities, often queer identities, making a decentralized solar world and really working together to achieve that. And I work a little bit with the ideas of metamodernism, particularly as written about by Hansi Freinacht, and he's described it as a gateway drug into metamodernism. And there could be a whole another seminar about metamodernism, but it's essentially this emerging um, idea of trying to move beyond postmodernism while holding on to the best of modernism and postmodernism at the same time. So that's one genre I'm looking at. The second is hope punk, which you'll see the punk appearing in a lot of these. It's really referencing cyberpunk, which was the original kind of literary genre that used punk. And cyberpunk is things like Blade Runner and so on that are often very dystopian, dark, highly technological futures, but the characters in them will be these rebels and people on the fringes, hence the punk aspect of that. And solar punk is still sort of buying into that in the sense of the people working with the renewable energies are the rebels and the makers and doing things on the fringes. Hope punk is in some sense a little bit different in that the rebellion is against the idea of dystopia and apathy and cynicism that comes with that, and that as one of the authors, Becky Chambers, has put it, to find and act on hope even in the face of dystopia is one of the most punk acts that you can take. So it's this cultivation of hope even when things seem really dark, which is pretty relevant to today's world. And a lot of hope punk, the worlds that are depicted in the literature are often quite dystopian, but the characters even in the face of that, determinedly pursue this sense of community and kindness and meaning. So the world itself that's depicted isn't always that hopeful, but there's hope found in the human relationships and the humanity of the characters that are navigating that space. It can slip a little bit into sentimentality and naive optimism, but uh, still an interesting genre to explore. And then the third one is a newer genre label called Throughtopia, and Rupert Reed described this as stories on how to get from here to there, how to live and love and vision and carve out a future through pressed times that will endure, visioning the politics and ecology of getting through. So it's intended to be a somewhat realistic vision of how we muddle through, sitting in between the poles of dystopia and utopia, a more realistic vision where much is often lost in these stories, conflict continues, but the characters somehow find paths to a better world, albeit often at a great cost to them and to the planet. So I mentioned metamodernism. I don't want to say too much about it today, but really just wanted to point to the idea here that what we see in some of these new genres is what's often positioned as a metamodernist idea, which is this oscillation between the sincere, hopeful spirit of modernism and the ironic, skeptical detachment of postmodernism. So combining kind of a modern faith in progress with postmodern critique and seeking to reap the best of both of those. And what is seen as the kind of quintessential pursuit of metamodernism is this idea of protopia, which is sort of similar to the idea of throughtopia I was just talking about. But it's been described as the massive set of interlinked projects of activists, thinkers, and practitioners around the world who seek to contribute to the necessary and desirable transformations of societies around the world. So stories, if you like, about linking people up, creating those conditions for generating better worlds. All right, so some examples. Solar punk. I'm focused here on an anthology collection that came out of Arizona State University. It's partly short stories, but also some essays about solar punk. I would argue that there's not great solar punk novels out there yet, but there's a lot of great solar punk short fiction. And so that's why I focused on a short fiction collection here. And what you see in these stories is it's really tangible. There is a really strong focus on technology, which we saw also in a lot of the official imaginaries, but it's very, very tangible technologies that are very much in service of humans. So there's things like in these stories, a city spanning carbon fiber scaffolding called the grid that then allows lots of decentralized homeowner managed solar arrays and vertical farms. So really technology creating the infrastructure for people to then act very independently in a very decentralized and democratic way. Things like agrivoltaics, co-locating solar PV and agriculture, biotechnologies like dragon trees that tap into deep aquifers, dirigibles that mine humidity from the air, reed batteries, woven genetically modified reeds that store megawatts of potential energy and unfold to release it. So much more imaginative, obviously, and probably less realistic, but pushing the boundaries of what we can imagine much more than the official imaginaries ever could. And what we see, one of the big differences here is a really strong focus on human agency and social justice. So humans as activists and organizers focused on social justice, humans as designers and bridge builders, mediating between diverse actors, and particularly humans as makers and artisans. Or to quote from one of the stories, techno entrepreneurs, libertarian craftspeople, inexorable makers, luminosity artists, making things of profound beauty. So trying to imagine a world that is aesthetically appealing as well as resolving the challenge of climate change. And of course, we get lots of imagery like this kind of thing, imagining often quite fanciful future worlds that is kind of the solar punk aesthetic. As an example of hope punk, I've chosen a psalm for the wild built by Becky Chambers, part of her monk and robot duology. And people have described reading this as like a warm, reassuring hug. It's not a fast-paced action novella. It's really a more gentle sort of philosophical meditation on purpose and nature and what a society might look like that's moved beyond ecological collapse. Centers on a tea monk who cycles their rickshaw-like dwelling from village to village, and the story of what happens in their search for meaning. And I won't spoil too much more of it than that, but it's a post-industrial future, so it's not set on Earth. It's set in a different place, but it's a society that did have an industrial age and then walked away from it and has now given half the planet back to non-humans, aiming to live really low impact lives focused on meaning and purpose in harmony with nature. And again, sort of trying to describe a really beautiful aesthetic, which you can see in the quotes there. The idea of things that are built for a lifetime. So it was a computer given to them on their 16th birthday, a reliable device built to last a lifetime, as all computers were. So far from the planned obsolescence that we have today. And a really thriving society where people take care of each other, the world takes care of us, and we take care of it, and around it goes. And then finally, the Throughtopias. And I've chosen the Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson as an example of this. It's not necessarily the most engaging read. He spends a little bit too much time getting really excited about particular policy solutions and spending pages and pages talking about that, and probably should have spent a bit more time on his characters. But despite that, it's a really interesting read. And there's no, one of the things I like about it is there's no single imaginary there, and it's summed up nicely in the quote. There were many realities on a planet this big, and so you get this messy mix of institutional change, of violent action and eco-terrorism, of questionable geoengineering efforts, of really inspiring social movements, sometimes working together, sometimes clashing, but ultimately leading to a better place, although after great losses, and particularly some pretty devastating opening scenes in the novel that really trigger a lot of the movement towards action. It leans towards a socialist politics and tries to defend that idea, but still uses markets and spends a lot of time exploring the idea of a carbon coin as a digital currency and a carbon reserve bank. It imagines shifts in human values and spends time exploring the idea of a new religion, an ecological religion, as something that could bind together this zero carbon future, some sort of citizen of Gaia or planetary consciousness. And this central idea that returns too often of what's good is what's good for the biosphere. So really sort of planet-centric set of values. So I've looked obviously across more than those novels, and what's emerging from these new genres is the sort of symbols and signs. We see net zero appearing here as well, but much more imaginative technological imagery, solar glass windows, floating solar arrays, biotechnology, zeppelins, rewilding, circular economy, the web of life, and so on and so forth, and a much more diverse range of actors. So scientists, engineers, communities and collectives, Indigenous peoples, activists and campaigners are much more prominent in these narratives. And governments, as opposed to being the leader in the official imaginaries, are often slow or problematic, but do end up facilitating transition. So a much stronger focus on human and non-human characters and their stories. Values of interconnectedness and symbiosis, stewardship and guardianship, resilience and adaptation, justice and equity, hope and imagination, respect for limits, and very, very often very rooted in place. Visions for the future of integrated green cities with soft infrastructure and restored ecosystems, decentralized and localized, and a transformation, cultural transformation away from consumerism and individualism. Assuming climate crisis as the reality, but that humanity has the capacity to change and that nature can be resilient with some help. The essential importance of interdependence and the need to move beyond economic growth. So the narrative here is more like a zero carbon future requires ecological restoration and healing, a mix of transformation and adaptation, decolonization and establishment of resilient, self-sufficient communities. Technology is a double-edged sword, the source of problems, but also a tool for salvation. And humans face a choice, and learning across generations can help us find agency. So it's a messy mix of postmodern emancipatory narratives with some metamodern tendencies, sincere hope in the face of dystopian reality. So the fictional imaginaries are highly imaginative, offering up visions of very different worlds. The bulk of those worlds are dystopian and undesirable, but in these new genres, we're starting to see some positive futures being imagined where zero carbon is achieved. In solar punk, you see humans in harmony with nature and technology integrated with the non-human world. Beautiful, practical zero carbon future, but often a little bit more focused on aesthetics than practice. Hope punk is often about slowing down, being more grounded in human relationships, but probably more of a vibe so far than a practical plan. And through utopias, imagine a messy but hopeful reality somewhere in between utopia and dystopia. To date, work in that genre has tended to require some sort of triggering crisis and catastrophic losses to happen before we find a way through. So the difference to the institutional imaginaries is really that people are at the heart of these stories, helping us to imagine our own roles in a zero carbon future. So to wrap up, genres like solar punk, well, this is a quote from Hansi Freinacht, the meta-modernist writer. Solar punk can do what merely intellectual arguments of better governance, of democracy, even of ecological collapse and the natural sciences cannot: entice the average person, in particular the established and new middle classes from across the world. And that gets at the heart of why I'm interested in these alternative zero carbon imaginaries, is that for us to build the kind of social contract that's going to be needed to achieve the transformations to a zero carbon future, we need to bring people along with us. And the official imaginaries are not doing that yet. And we're starting to see the backlash in how people are responding to proposals for renewable energy projects in various places around the country. There's not a lot to entice in those institutional imaginaries. They're cold technological futures that look much like the present, but with fossil fuels swapped out for renewables. And there's not a clear role for ordinary people. There's a lot more to entice in the fictional imaginaries. Ordinary people are deeply present. There's imagined worlds that are more appealing in a lot of ways, but often not much in the way of practical and feasible pathways for getting there yet. So I think there are things that institutional imaginaries can learn from the fictional imaginaries. Firstly, that techno-economic change never happens without socio-cultural change, and we need to help people imagine what that means for a zero carbon future. That people need to be at the heart of these zero carbon imaginaries. They're going to be the ones that create and live in a zero carbon future. And we need that social contract for transformation to bring people along. And to get on board with transformation, people need to be inspired. So I'll leave it there and really happy to have some questions and discussion. There's references up the back here as well, and happy to share the slides later.